What if I told you there was a slave trade in America, so brutal that it made regular slavery look merciful? A trade where children were sold for more money than houses, where 12-year-old girls were worth more than grown men, and where the buyers weren't looking for workers, they were looking for victims. This is the story of the fancy girl trade. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this was buried from history books for over 150 years. But first, smash that subscribe button, because YouTube doesn't want you seeing content like this. Richmond, Virginia, 1820. Picture yourself walking through a slave market. The air is thick with the sound of crying, shouting, and the crack of whips. But there's something happening here that will turn your stomach. While most enslaved people are selling for a few $100s, there's a separate auction. And the prices? They're astronomical. $1,500, $3,000, even $5,000 in modern currency for a single person. But here's what will shock you. They're all children, young girls, some barely 10 years old. How many of you learned about this in school? Drop never in the comments if this is news to you, because I guarantee it is. Let me paint you a picture so vivid you'll never forget it. It's a Tuesday morning in 1823. The cobblestones are slick with morning dew and other things you don't want to think about. Merchants are setting up their stalls, hawking everything from tobacco to tools to human beings. But there's a crowd gathering around one particular platform. The auctioneer, let's call him Thomas, is a well-dressed man with a booming voice and cold eyes. He's been in this business for 15 years, and he knows exactly what his customers want. Gentlemen, Thomas calls out, his voice cutting through the morning air. Today we have something special. A selection of the finest fancy girls you'll find this side of New Orleans. The crowd presses closer. These aren't just any buyers. These are wealthy planters, successful businessmen, even a few politicians. Men who could afford to spend more on a single human being than most people earned in 5 years. But wait, let me ask you something. Right now, as you're watching this, you might be thinking, this is just history. But what if I told you that human trafficking generates $150 billion annually today? What if I told you that the techniques used in the fancy girl trade are still being used right now, in 2024? If that connection just hit you, if you just realized this isn't just a history lesson, drop A in the comments. Because that's exactly the kind of awareness that changes the world. Now picture Sarah. That's not her real name. Her real name was probably taken from her the day she was stolen from her family in Maryland. Sarah is 13 years old. 13. The same age as kids starting 8th grade today. She's standing on that auction block, wearing a dress that's finer than anything she's ever owned. The irony is sick. She's dressed like a lady while being sold like livestock. Her hands are shaking, but she's trying not to cry. She learned quickly that showing fear made things worse. I want you to really think about this. Imagine if this was your daughter, your sister, your friend. Imagine if someone you loved was standing there, about to be sold to the highest bidder for purposes that would destroy their childhood forever. The auctioneer begins his pitch. This fine young lady is fresh from Virginia. Notice her light complexion, her refined features. She's been trained in household management and other domestic duties. That pause. Those other domestic duties. Everyone in that crowd knew exactly what he meant. The bidding starts at $80. Within minutes, it's at $150, then $200 in 1823. The crowd is energized now, feeding off each other's desire and Sarah's terror. These men aren't just buying a person. They're buying a fantasy, a status symbol, a living trophy that says, I'm wealthy enough to afford the most expensive human being on the market. But how did we get here? How did American society reach a point where selling children for sexual exploitation was not just accepted, but celebrated as good business? The answer takes us back to the late 1700s. The tobacco economy in Virginia and Maryland was collapsing. Planters who had built their wealth on tobacco suddenly found themselves with more enslaved people than they could profitably employ. The solution seemed simple. Sell the surplus to the booming cotton plantations in the deep South. This became known as the domestic slave trade, and it was devastating on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Imagine entire communities being torn apart, parents watching their children sold away, knowing they'd never see them again, spouses ripped from each other's arms, siblings scattered to different states, different lives, different hells. If you're feeling overwhelmed by this, that's normal. This is heavy stuff. But here's why I need you to keep watching, because understanding this history is the only way to prevent it from happening again. And trust me, it is happening again, just in different forms. But some slave traders noticed something interesting in this human marketplace. Young women with lighter skin, often the daughters of previous sexual assaults by white men, were commanding premium prices, not for their labor skills, but for their appearance, their youth, their vulnerability. In that slavery era, a strong male field hand might sell for $80. A skilled craftsman might bring $100. But a fancy girl? She could fetch $300, sometimes more. The profit margin was irresistible. Think about that math for a moment. In today's money, that's the difference between selling someone for $5,000 versus $8,000. 4. Traders focused on profit. The choice was obvious. And this is where our story gets truly horrifying. Because these traders didn't just stumble into this market, they perfected it. They created systems, techniques, and networks that turned sexual exploitation into one of the most profitable industries in America. Wait until you hear about Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, 2 men who built a corporate empire on selling children. Their story will make you question everything you thought you knew about American capitalism. But let's return to Sarah for a moment. The bidding has reached $1,000. A wealthy cotton planter from Mississippi is competing with a New Orleans businessman who owns several entertainment establishments. Each bid seals her fate a little more. The auctioneer calls for final bids. $1,300, $1,400, $1,500. Sold. To the man from New Orleans, Sarah's childhood officially ends with the fall of a gavel. The crowd disperses, already forgetting her face, moving on to the next lot. But for Sarah, the nightmare is just beginning. What's happening to Sarah isn't unique. It's happening to dozens of girls every day across the South. In Richmond, in Charleston, in Savannah, in New Orleans. The fancy girl trade has become so normalized that newspapers advertise these sales openly, using coded language that everyone understands. Find fancy girl for sale, very likely and well trained in domestic duties. Translation: young, light-skinned, and groomed for sexual exploitation. Elegant mulatto girl, 16 years of age, of good character and breeding. Translation: mixed race, still a teenager, and prepared for a life of abuse. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. This isn't happening in secret. This is happening in broad daylight, with the full knowledge and approval of respectable society. Churches that preach about morality stay silent. Politicians who speak about family values own fancy girls themselves. Newspapers that claim to represent community standards profit from advertising these sales. Banks that present themselves as pillars of the community finance these purchases. I want to challenge you right now. As you're watching this, think about the systems in your own life that you might be ignoring. What injustices are happening in plain sight that we've normalized? What forms of exploitation have we made so common that we don't even see them anymore? Because that's how the fancy girl trade thrived, not through secrecy, but through willful blindness. through people choosing not to see what was right in front of them. Sarah is being led away from the auction block now, her new owner discussing transportation arrangements with the seller. She doesn't know that her journey to New Orleans will involve weeks of preparation, grooming, and abuse designed to maximize her value when she arrives. She doesn't know about the slave jails where she be imprisoned, the techniques used to transform terrified children into fancy girls, or the industrial scale operation that's about to process her like a product on an assembly line. But you're about to learn all of that. And I warn you, what comes next is even more disturbing than what you've already heard. You want to know how evil becomes systematic? How individual cruelty transforms into industrial efficiency? Let me take you inside the machine that created fancy girls. What I'm about to describe isn't just abuse, it's manufacturing. The systematic transformation of children into products through a process so refined, so calculated, that it operated like a factory of fear. If you're feeling sick right now, good. That means you're human. But don't click away, because someone needs to tell their story. And if we don't understand how these systems worked, we can't recognize when they're happening again. Remember Sarah? She's now in the custody of a slave trader named James Mitchell. Mitchell specializes in the fancy girl trade, and he's been perfecting his methods for over a decade. To him, Sarah isn't a person. She's raw material that needs to be refined into a finished product. The journey from Richmond to New Orleans will take 3 weeks. 3 weeks that will strip away whatever childhood Sarah has left and replace it with the skills, appearance, and demeanor that Mitchell's customers expect. First stop, a slave jail in Alexandria, Virginia. Picture a warehouse, but instead of storing goods, it's storing people. The building is 3 stories tall, with barred windows and a central courtyard surrounded by high walls topped with broken glass. This isn't just a holding facility, it's a processing center. Mitchell operates it like a businessman, which in his mind he is. He has schedules, systems, and procedures, all designed to maximize profit. Now, before I describe what happens in these jails, I need to ask, how are you doing? This is intense content, and I want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. If you need a moment, pause the video. But please come back, because this history matters. Also, if this video is opening your eyes to something you never knew existed, hit that like button. It helps more people discover this hidden history. Sarah is assigned to the preparation wing, a section reserved for the young women destined for the fancy trade. The conditions are deliberately designed to break down resistance while maintaining physical appearance. The rooms are cramped, with up to 6 girls sharing a space barely large enough for 2. There are no beds, just straw mattresses that are breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and disease. The smell is overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, human waste, fear, and despair all mixed together. But Mitchell pays attention to certain details. The girls destined for the fancy trade eat slightly better food than the others, not out of kindness, but because buyers want healthy-looking merchandise. They're given soap to wash with, though the water is often dirty. They're allowed to keep their hair clean because tangled. Matted hair reduces value. Every morning, Sarah and the other girls are subjected to what Mitchell calls preparation training. They're taught how to walk with their heads up, how to smile on command, how to speak only when spoken to. They practice curtsying, standing with proper posture, and responding to questions with the right tone of voice. But there's something else happening during this training. The girls are being psychologically broken down and rebuilt according to Mitchell's specifications. They're told repeatedly that their old lives are over, that their families have forgotten them, that their only value now lies in pleasing their future owners. Here's something that will make your stomach turn. Mitchell keeps detailed records of each girl's development. He tracks their weight, their health, their compliance, and their marketability. These ledgers, some of which still exist in historical archives. Read like livestock breeding records. Sarah, age 13, gained 4 pounds this week. Complexion improving. Resistance decreasing. Estimated value, $2,000, $2,200. Think about that. A human being reduced to a few lines in a business ledger. As the weeks pass, Sarah's transformation accelerates. She's given new clothes, still simple, but cleaner and better fitting than what she wore on the plantation. Mitchell has learned that buyers want to see potential, not finished product. They want to imagine what their purchase will look like after they've had time to train her themselves. But the clothes are just the beginning. Sarah is taught to apply basic cosmetics, a little powder to even her complexion, a touch of color to her lips. She's shown how to arrange her hair in styles that Mitchell's customers prefer. Every detail is calculated to maximize appeal. I need to pause here for a moment and address something. You might be wondering why I'm going into such detail about these horrific processes. It's because understanding how systematic exploitation works is the only way to recognize and stop it. Right now, in 2024, there are people using similar techniques to exploit vulnerable individuals. The methods have evolved, but the basic principles remain the same: isolation, manipulation, gradual conditioning, and the systematic destruction of self-worth. If you're starting to see these connections, if you're realizing that this isn't just history, but a blueprint that's still being used today, comment "I see IT" below, because awareness is the first step toward prevention. But Mitchell's preparation goes far beyond clothing and cosmetics. The sexual abuse begins almost immediately. Mitchell and his employees see it as breaking in the merchandise, preparing the girls for what will be expected of them after sale. Sarah, like the others, has no protection from this abuse. There are no laws defending her, no authorities she can appeal to, no escape routes available. The legal system that's supposed to protect children has explicitly excluded her from protection because of her race and status. Let me read you an actual court ruling from this period, because you need to understand how the legal system enabled this horror. The rape of a slave woman by her master cannot be considered a crime, as the woman is his property to dispose of as he sees fit. The law recognizes no injury to property by the owner of that property. That's not my interpretation. Those are the actual words used by judges to justify sexual violence against enslaved women and girls. Understands that physical control isn't enough. He needs to break Sarah's spirit, to make her compliant not just through fear, but through the destruction of hope. He uses techniques that modern psychologists would recognize as systematic psychological warfare: isolation from other support systems. Check. Constant criticism and devaluation. Check. Unpredictable. Punishment and reward. Check. Destruction of personal identity. Check. Creation of learned helplessness. Check. Every technique used by modern human traffickers can be traced back to methods perfected by men like Mitchell. This is heavy stuff, I know. If you're still watching, you're among the small percentage of people who can handle difficult truths. That makes you part of the solution, not the problem. But I need to ask, are you sharing this video? Are you helping spread awareness of these hidden histories? Because silence is what allowed these systems to thrive then, and it's what allows modern trafficking to thrive now. After 3 weeks in Mitchell's jail, Sarah barely resembles the frightened child who was sold in Richmond. She's been transformed into what Mitchell calls a premium product. She's gained weight. Her skin has been treated to remove blemishes. Her hair has been styled, and her spirit has been systematically broken. But most importantly, from Mitchell's perspective, she's been trained. She knows to keep her eyes downcast unless instructed otherwise. She responds to commands immediately and without question. She's learned to smile when buyers examine her, even though every instinct screams for her to run. The journey to New Orleans is itself another form of abuse. Sarah and 24 other enslaved people are loaded onto a ship that's designed to carry cargo, not passengers. The conditions are horrific. Barely enough room to lie down, inadequate food and water, no privacy, no dignity. But even during transport, the abuse continues. The ship's crew sees the fancy girls as entertainment for the voyage. There's no protection, no oversight, no accountability. What happens on the ship stays on the ship dot when Sarah finally arrives in New Orleans. She's about to enter the largest slave market in North America. This city has built much of its wealth on the buying and selling of human beings, and the fancy girl trade is one of its most profitable sectors. Auction houses here are different from the rough platforms of Richmond. These are elaborate showrooms designed to appeal to wealthy buyers who see themselves as sophisticated men of the world. Crystal chandeliers, polished floors, and velvet curtains create an atmosphere of luxury that masks the horror of what's actually happening. Before Sarah can be sold, she undergoes one final preparation process. She's bathed, dressed in finer clothes than she's ever worn, and given final instructions on how to present herself. The transformation is complete. The frightened child from Maryland has been manufactured into a fancy girl, ready for market. But here's what Sarah doesn't know, what none of these girls know. The auction is just another beginning, not an end. What happens after she's sold? What awaits her? The auction ends. The crowd disperses. The money changes hands. And now we cross the threshold into the part of this story that was hidden for 150 years. Part that happened behind closed doors, in private homes, in secret rooms, in the shadows where no one could witness the true cost of the fancy girl trade. What I'm about to tell you is the hardest part of this story. But it's also the most important, because this is where we see not just the cruelty of individuals, but the systematic dehumanization that slavery made possible. Before I continue, I need to say something. If you're a survivor of sexual abuse or trafficking, this section might be particularly difficult. Please take care of yourself. But if you can stay with me, your perspective and strength add power to these stories that need to be told. Sarah has been sold. The winning bidder is a man named Charles Beauregard, a wealthy sugar planter who owns a mansion in the Garden District and a plantation outside the city. He paid $2,300 for Sarah, more money than most people in America will see in their entire lives. But Beauregard isn't buying Sarah for her labor skills. He already has dozens of field hands, house servants, and craftspeople. He's buying her for one purpose, and everyone in that auction room knows exactly what it is. Picture Sarah's first ride through New Orleans in Beauregard's carriage. She's seeing the city that will be her prison for the rest of her life. Elegant mansions with wrought iron balconies, lush gardens hidden behind high walls, and streets bustling with commerce built on slavery. The irony is devastating. New Orleans is one of the wealthiest cities in America, famous for its culture, its food, its music, and its joie de vivre. But all of that wealth, all of that culture, all of that joy is built on the systematic exploitation of people like Sarah. I want you to think about this as we continue. How many times have you heard New Orleans described as romantic, mysterious, culturally rich? How often is that description accompanied by the reality that this romance was built on the rape and exploitation of children? If this is changing how you see American history, how you understand the foundations of American wealth, drop a response in the comments. Beauregard's mansion is a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering. 3 stories of elegant architecture, surrounded by manicured gardens and staffed by dozens of enslaved people. From the outside, it looks like paradise. From the inside, for people like Sarah, it's hell with chandelier lighting. Sarah is taken not to the main house, but to a smaller building in the back of the property. This is where Beauregard keeps his special acquisitions. Young women purchased for his personal use, hidden from the view of polite society and even from his own wife. Because here's something you need to understand. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women wasn't just tolerated in the antebellum South. It was institutionalized. But it was also hidden, wrapped in layers of denial and social fiction that allowed everyone to pretend it wasn't happening. Beauregard's wife, Marie, knows exactly why her husband purchased Sarah. She knows about the other young women in the back building, knows about the children they've borne who look suspiciously like her husband. But the social code of the time demands that she maintain the fiction of ignorance. This system brutalized white women too, in different but significant ways. Marie Beauregard lives with the daily humiliation of her husband's infidelities, but she has no legal recourse, no social support, and no acceptable way to express her anger except by taking it out on the enslaved, women who are as much victims as she is. Harriet Jacobs, in her memoir, described the impossible position of plantation mistresses. The master's wife was often more cruel than her husband. She seemed to think that her husband's victims were to blame for his conduct. This is one of the most insidious aspects of oppressive systems. They turn victims against each other, instead of against the system itself. We see this pattern throughout history, and in modern trafficking situations too. If you're recognizing these patterns, if you're seeing how systems of exploitation create multiple layers of victims, you're developing the kind of awareness that can help prevent these patterns from repeating. For Sarah, life in Beauregard's mansion is a nightmare disguised as privilege. She's given better food than field slaves, finer clothes than house servants, and her own room in the back building. To outsiders, it might look like she's been lucky in her placement, but Sarah knows the truth. Every comfort comes with a price. Every meal, every dress, every moment of relative safety is payment for her compliance with Beauregard's demands. She's not a servant. She's a sex slave with better accommodations. During the day, Sarah might work in the main house, helping with light domestic duties under the watchful eye of Marie Beauregard, who treats her with cold hostility. But everyone knows that Sarah's real work begins after the sun sets. Beauregard visits her several times a week, treating these encounters as his right, his property entitlement. There's no consent involved, no consideration of Sarah's feelings or desires. She exists for his pleasure, and the law backs up his absolute power over her body. But the physical abuse is only part of Sarah's torment. Beauregard employs psychological tactics designed to break down her resistance and make her compliant. He alternates between cruelty and false kindness, creating a pattern of trauma bonding that makes escape seem impossible. One day, he might beat her for imagined infractions. The next, he might bring her small gifts or praise her appearance. This unpredictability keeps Sarah in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing what to expect, always walking on eggshells. These are classic techniques of psychological manipulation that we now recognize as hallmarks of abusive relationships and trafficking situations. The alternating punishment and reward, the isolation from support systems, the gradual erosion of self-worth. These methods didn't disappear with slavery. Inevitably, Sarah becomes pregnant. She's 14 years old. In any just society, this would be recognized as child rape resulting in pregnancy. But in antebellum Louisiana, it's just business as usual. Beauregard shows no concern for Sarah's health or well-being during her pregnancy. If anything, he sees it as proof of his virility and Sarah's fertility, both of which add to her value in his mind. The child she carries will be born into slavery. Another piece of property for him to own. Sarah gives birth to a son who looks remarkably like Beauregard. The resemblance is so strong that even Marie Beauregard can't pretend ignorance, but the social fiction must be maintained. The child is recorded in plantation records simply as Sarah's boy, no father listed, no acknowledgement of the obvious. For Sarah, motherhood brings both joy and terror. She loves her son desperately, but she knows that this love makes her even more vulnerable. Beauregard now has the ultimate weapon to control her behavior, the threat of selling her child away from her. But Sarah's story is just one thread in a much larger tapestry of exploitation. Across New Orleans, across the South, similar scenes are playing out in mansions, plantations, and boarding houses. The fancy girl trade has created an entire underground economy of sexual slavery. Some women are forced into prostitution in the city's numerous brothels. Others become concubines to wealthy merchants, politicians, or professionals. Still others are passed between multiple owners like party favors, their value diminishing with each transaction. Let me tell you about another aspect of this trade that's even more horrifying than individual ownership. The commercial brothels that specialized in enslaved women and girls. In New Orleans' infamous red light district, establishments openly advertised their fancy girls to wealthy clientele. These weren't just any prostitutes. They were enslaved women and girls who had been purchased specifically for sexual exploitation and had no choice in their participation. Numbers are staggering. A successful brothel might own a dozen fancy girls, each generating hundreds of dollars per month in revenue. The initial investment of $2,000, $3,000 per girl could be recouped in less than a year, after which everything was pure profit. But the human cost was devastating. Most women in these situations survived only a few years. Disease, violence, and despair took a toll that no amount of profit could justify. Not that the owners cared about justification. I need to pause here and acknowledge something. This is incredibly difficult content to process. If you're feeling overwhelmed, angry, or heartbroken, that's completely normal and appropriate. But I also want to ask, are you starting to understand why this history was buried? Why textbooks focused on cotton and tobacco instead of sexual slavery? Because confronting this truth forces us to acknowledge that American prosperity was built not just on labor exploitation, but on the systematic rape and abuse of children. Throughout all of this horror, the legal system provided absolute protection for the abusers and no recourse for the victims. Courts consistently ruled that enslaved women could not be raped because they were property, not people. The concept of consent simply didn't exist for them in the eyes of the law. In Mississippi, a judge ruled, the violation of a slave woman by her master is not rape, as the master has absolute authority over his property. In Virginia, another court declared, slaves have no legal rights that white men are bound to respect. These weren't aberrant decisions by rogue judges. These were the systematic legal foundations that made the fancy girl trade possible and profitable. But perhaps most disturbing was how normalized this exploitation became. Churches that preached about morality stayed silent about the systematic rape happening in their communities. Politicians who spoke about family values owned fancy girls themselves. Newspapers that claimed to represent community standards profited from advertising these. Sales. Society as a whole chose willful blindness over confronting an uncomfortable truth. And in that silence, the exploitation thrived. Sarah's story, and the stories of thousands like her, could end here in despair and defeat. The system seemed perfect in its cruelty, unbeatable in its power, permanent in its foundations. But what the traders, the buyers, and the entire system didn't count on was the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. They didn't expect resistance. They didn't anticipate that their victims would find ways to fight back, to survive, and to leave legacies that would eventually bring their entire system crashing down. Because this story isn't just about exploitation. It's also about resistance, survival, and the power of truth to eventually triumph over even the most systematic evil. And that's where we're going next. Now, I want to pull back the curtain and show you the men who turned sexual exploitation into one of the most profitable industries in American history. Because the fancy girl trade wasn't just individual cruelty. It was corporate enterprise, systematic business, Industrial-scale human trafficking that generated more wealth than most legitimate businesses of the era. Hook number 4 to 2415. Meet Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, two names you've probably never heard, but who built one of the largest corporations in 1800s America. Their business model? Buying and selling human beings. Their specialty? Sexual exploitation of children. Their legacy? Fortunes that echo through American wealth to this day. Engagement CHECK 2430. Before we dive into their story, I need to know, are you still with me? This is the part where we see how individual evil becomes systematic oppression, how personal cruelty becomes corporate policy. If you're ready for this deep dive into the business of human misery, drop a in the comments. The Franklin and Armfield Empire, 2445. Franklin and Armfield wasn't just a slave trading company. It was a vertically integrated human trafficking corporation. They had purchasing agents in Virginia and Maryland, transportation networks by land and sea, warehouses for inventory management, and sales operations in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Between 1828 and 1836, they purchased and sold over 10,000 human beings. 10,000 lives destroyed, families shattered, childhoods ended, all for profit margins that would make modern corporations envious. Their most lucrative product line wasn't field hands or house servants. It was fancy girls, and they perfected every aspect of this trade with the cold efficiency of modern industrial manufacturing. Corporate structure, 25 to 15. Picture this operation like a modern corporation. Franklin handled the northern operations, purchasing inventory in Virginia and Maryland, managing the slave jails that served as processing centers, and coordinating transportation south. Armfield managed southern operations, sales, marketing, customer relationships, and market development. They had branch offices, standardized procedures, accounting systems that tracked every detail of their human merchandise, and marketing strategies that would be familiar to any modern business school graduate. The purchasing operation minus 25 to 45. Franklin's purchasing agents scoured the Chesapeake region looking for product that met their specifications. They had detailed criteria for different market segments, but the fancy girl specifications were particularly precise. Age, preferably 12 to 16. Complexion, light-skinned. Physical appearance, what they considered attractive. And temperament, what they called tractable. These agents worked like talent scouts for a grotesque entertainment industry. They attended estate sales, bankruptcy auctions, and foreclosure proceedings, always looking for young women who met their criteria. They built relationships with financially struggling planters who might be willing to sell their most valuable slaves for quick cash. Engagement moment 26 minutes and 0 seconds. I want you to think about this corporate efficiency applied to human trafficking. The systematic approach, the market research, the customer targeting, these weren't random acts of cruelty. This was business strategy applied to human exploitation. If this corporate approach to human trafficking is reminding you of modern systems of exploitation, you're making exactly the connections this history is meant to illuminate. The processing centers minus 26 to 30. Franklin's slave jail in Alexandria was like a manufacturing facility designed to transform raw materials, terrified children into finished products, compliant, fancy girls. They had separate wings for different types of merchandise, specialized staff for different aspects of preparation, and quality control processes to ensure maximum market value. The fancy girl wing operated like a finishing school designed by sadists. Girls were taught to walk, talk, and present themselves according to buyer preferences. They were given basic education, enough to seem refined, but not enough to be dangerous. They were trained in household skills that buyers valued, but most importantly, they were psychologically conditioned to accept their fate. Franklin employed techniques that modern psychologists would recognize as systematic. Brainwashing, isolation from family and community, destruction of previous identity, creation of learned helplessness, and trauma bonding with their captors. The marketing machine, 27 minutes and 0 seconds. Armfield's marketing operation in New Orleans was sophisticated, beyond anything you might expect for the 1830s. He understood that he wasn't just selling people. He was selling fantasies, status symbols, and sexual novelty to wealthy men who saw human ownership as the ultimate luxury. His advertisements in New Orleans newspapers used coded language that everyone understood, but that maintained the veneer of respectability that buyers required. Fancy girls of superior quality and refinement meant young, light-skinned, and trained for sexual exploitation. Elegant mulatto ladies suitable for the finest establishments meant mixed-race teenagers prepared for high-end prostitution. The showroom experience, 27 minutes and 30 seconds. Armfield's auction house wasn't just a sales facility. It was a theatrical experience designed to maximize both prices and customer satisfaction. The main showroom featured polished floors, crystal chandeliers, and velvet curtains that created an atmosphere of luxury and sophistication. But the real action happened in private viewing, rooms where serious buyers could inspect merchandise away from public view. These sessions were barely disguised sexual assault, but they were presented as quality control for discriminating customers. Shocking revenue numbers, 28 minutes and 0 seconds. The profits were astronomical. While field hands sold for $800 to $1,000, fancy girls regularly brought $2,000 to $3,000 each. Franklin and Armfield's profit margins on these sales exceeded 300%, higher than any legitimate business in America. In just 8 years of operation, they generated over $3.5 million in revenue, equivalent to over $100 million today. But more importantly, they processed over 1,000 fancy girls through their system, each representing a life destroyed, a childhood ended, a family torn apart. Pattern interrupt 28 to 15. Let me put these numbers in perspective. Franklin and Armfield's revenue from selling children into sexual slavery exceeded the GDP of most American states at the time. They were literally making more money from child trafficking than entire state economies were generating from all economic activity combined. The network effect minus 28 to 30. But Franklin and Armfield weren't operating in isolation. They were part of a larger network of traders, financiers, transporters, and service providers that made the fancy girl trade possible on an industrial scale. Banks provided financing for purchases. Insurance companies offered policies to protect against loss of property during transport. Shipping companies provided specialized vessels for human cargo. Boarding houses offered temporary housing for merchandise, awaiting sale. Even seemingly respectable institutions were complicit. Hotels hosted private auctions in their ballrooms. Newspapers profited from advertising sales. Law firms handled the paperwork that made it all legal. The customer base, 29 minutes and 0 seconds. Who were the customers for this systematic exploitation? They weren't just plantation owners or rough frontier types. The customer base included some of the most prominent men in American society: politicians, judges, businessmen, professionals, and even clergy. In New Orleans, the ownership of fancy girls became a status symbol among the wealthy elite. It was proof of financial success, demonstration of masculine power, and indulgence in forbidden pleasures that society officially condemned, but privately celebrated. Engagement challenge, 29 minutes and 30 seconds. I want you to think about this normalization of exploitation among the elite. How does a society reach a point where its most successful, educated, and influential members openly participate in the systematic abuse of children? Because understanding that process is key to recognizing when it's happening again. And it is happening again, just in different forms. The political protection, 29 minutes and 45 seconds. The fancy girl trade thrived because it had political protection at the highest levels. Politicians who owned slaves themselves weren't about to pass laws restricting the slave trade. Judges who profited from the system weren't going to rule against it. Law enforcement officers who were customers weren't going to investigate it. The entire legal and political system was designed to protect this exploitation, not prevent it. Laws explicitly stated that enslaved people were property, not persons. Courts consistently ruled that crimes against property couldn't be committed by the owner of that property. The financial infrastructure, 30 minutes and 15 seconds. Perhaps most disturbing was how deeply the fancy girl trade was integrated into the American financial system. Major banks in both the North and South provided financing for slave purchases. Insurance companies offered policies to protect these investments. Even international financial institutions were involved, as American slave traders used their profits to invest in global markets. The wealth generated by sexual exploitation didn't stay isolated in the South. It flowed throughout the American economy, funding everything from railroad construction to industrial development to westward expansion. In 1836, Franklin and Armfield dissolved their partnership, both having accumulated enough wealth to retire as gentlemen. Franklin purchased a plantation in Tennessee and became a respected member of his community. Armfield bought land in Virginia and was known as a successful businessman and philanthropist. Neither man ever faced consequences for their role in trafficking thousands of children into sexual slavery. Instead, they were celebrated as shrewd entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses. Their wealth bought them respectability, social status, and historical whitewashing that lasted for generations. Fortunes built on the fancy girl trade didn't disappear after the Civil War. They were invested in legitimate businesses, passed down through family lines, and used to fund institutions that still exist today. Some of America's oldest universities, banks, and corporations can trace portions of their founding capital to profits from human trafficking. This isn't ancient history with no modern relevance. This is the foundation upon which much of American wealth was built, and those foundations still shape our economic and social systems today. But here's what Franklin, Armfield, and all the other profiteers of human misery didn't anticipate. The voices of their victims wouldn't stay silent forever. The women and girls they exploited would find ways to resist, to survive, and to speak truth to power. And eventually, those voices would grow into a chorus that would challenge not just individual traders, but the entire system of exploitation. The resistance that would ultimately bring down the fancy girl trade was already beginning, even as Franklin and Armfield counted their profits. Because this story isn't just about the perpetrators. It's about the survivors. It's about the unbreakable strength of the human spirit, the power of resistance, and the way truth eventually triumphs over even the most systematic evil. That's where our story ends. Not with defeat, but with defiance. Not with silence, but with voices that refuse to be silenced. And those voices have lessons for us today that we ignore at our own peril. This is where the story could end in despair, with millions of dollars in profits, thousands of lives destroyed, and a system so entrenched it seemed permanent. But that's not how this story ends. Because what the traders, the buyers, and the entire system underestimated was the unbreakable power of the human spirit. What I'm about to tell you is the most important part of this entire story. Because while the fancy girl trade tried to reduce human beings to commodities, it failed. And the proof of that failure didn't just survive. It built the foundation of American culture, shaped our music, literature, and art, and created legacies that continue to inspire resistance movements today. If you're still here after everything we've covered, you're among the small percentage of people who can handle difficult truths and complex history. That makes you part of the solution. But I need to ask, are you sharing this story? Because the same silence that protected these systems then is what protects modern trafficking. Now, let's return to Sarah for a moment. Remember her, 13 years old, sold into sexual slavery, imprisoned in Beauregard's mansion, forced to bear his child. By every measure, the system has won. She's isolated, powerless, and completely at the mercy of her abusers. But Sarah hasn't been broken. Not completely. Every night, after Beauregard leaves her quarters, she whispers stories to her son. Stories about his grandmother in Maryland, about freedom, about a God who sees suffering and promises justice. In those whispers, Sarah is committing acts of resistance that the system can't detect or prevent. This might not seem like much, a young woman telling stories to her baby, but preserving memory, maintaining identity, and passing down truth across generations was one of the most powerful forms of resistance available to enslaved people. Slavery tried to erase the past, to make people forget who they were before bondage, to destroy connections to family, culture, and community. But women like Sarah refused to let that erasure happen. They became living libraries, preserving stories, songs, and traditions that would otherwise have been lost forever. Some women fought back more directly. Running away was extraordinarily dangerous, especially for fancy girls who were closely watched and highly valuable. But escape attempts did happen, and they reveal incredible courage in the face of almost certain failure. Let me read you an actual runaway advertisement from the New Orleans Picayune, 1851. $300 reward, ran away from the subscriber, a bright mulatto girl named Celia, about 16 years of age, very likely with long straight hair. She was recently purchased at high price and is believed to be attempting to return to Virginia. Any person apprehending said girl will receive the above reward. Think about Celia for a moment. 16 years old, sold into sexual slavery, closely watched and heavily guarded. Yet she chose to risk everything, torture, death, or worse punishment if caught, for even the possibility of freedom. That $300 reward, by the way, represents about $10,000 in today's money. That's how valuable these girls were to their owners, and how desperately they would pursue anyone who tried to escape. The most famous account of resistance to sexual slavery comes from Harriet Jacobs, who published her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, in 1861. Her story reveals both the horror of the fancy girl trade and the extraordinary lengths women would go to resist it. Jacobs was sexually harassed by her owner from the age of 15. Rather than submit to his demands, she entered into a relationship with another white man, not out of desire, but as a strategic choice to maintain some control over her own body and protect herself from her owner's violence. When that strategy failed to provide adequate protection, Jacobs made an almost unthinkable choice. She hid in a tiny crawl space above her grandmother's house for 7 years. 7 years. The space was 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 3 feet high at its tallest point. She could barely move, couldn't stand up, and endured scorching heat in summer and freezing cold in winter. But Jacob's resistance didn't end with her physical escape. She spent years learning to read and write, then used those skills to document her experiences and expose the sexual exploitation that society wanted to keep hidden. Her book was one of the first published accounts to explicitly describe the sexual abuse of enslaved women. It broke the silence that protected the system and gave voice to countless women who had been silenced by death, distance, or fear. Jacobs published her book in 1861, right at the beginning of the Civil War. She knew that telling her story would expose her to criticism, judgment, and danger. But she also knew that silence was complicity. I want to ask you, what stories in your own time are being silenced? What truths are being hidden because they're uncomfortable or inconvenient? Because the courage to speak truth to power didn't end with slavery. Beyond individual acts of resistance, enslaved communities developed collective strategies for survival and resistance that preserved humanity in inhuman conditions. Music became a form of coded communication, with spirituals carrying messages about escape routes and resistance activities. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot wasn't just a religious song. It was a signal that the Underground Railroad was operating in the area. Wade in the Water provided practical advice for escaping pursuit by tracking dogs. Follow the Drinking Gourd contained detailed directions for navigating north to freedom. Enslaved communities also preserved their stories through oral tradition, passing down accounts of resistance, survival, and dignity from generation to generation. These stories served multiple purposes. They preserved historical truth, they provided models of courage for future generations, and they maintained connections to identity and community that slavery tried to destroy. Many of these oral histories weren't written down until the 1930s, when the Works Progress Administration interviewed formerly enslaved people. But the stories they told revealed a hidden history of resistance that had been preserved for decades through the power of memory and storytelling. Even within the legal system that was designed to protect slavery, some people found ways to resist. Free people of color, white abolitionists, and even some enslaved people themselves used the courts to challenge the system wherever possible. These legal challenges rarely succeeded, but they served important purposes. They created legal precedents that could be built upon later. They exposed the contradictions and cruelties of the slave system to public scrutiny, and they demonstrated that even within an oppressive system, resistance was possible. Some enslaved people found ways to resist economically, using skills and knowledge to create small spaces of autonomy within the system of bondage. They might earn money through craft work, food sales, or other services, then use that money to purchase freedom for family members or to support escape attempts. This economic resistance was particularly powerful because it used the master's own system, the market economy, against them. Every dollar earned by an enslaved person was a small victory, a tiny assertion of human agency within a system designed to deny that agency. The resistance strategies developed during slavery didn't disappear with emancipation. They evolved and adapted, becoming the foundation for civil rights movements, labor organizing, women's rights activism, and countless other struggles for justice and equality. The spirituals became gospel music and protest songs. The oral traditions became African American literature and folklore. The strategies of resistance became models for later social movements. Today, anti-trafficking organizations use many of the same strategies that enslaved people developed to resist the fancy girl trade, preserving survivor stories, creating support networks, using legal challenges to expose system failures, and building economic alternatives for vulnerable populations. The connection isn't just historical, it's practical. Understanding how people resisted sexual exploitation in the past provides blueprints for fighting human trafficking today. If you're seeing these connections, if you're understanding that this history isn't just about the past, but about ongoing struggles for human dignity and freedom, you're getting the most important message of this entire video. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? The Civil War ended legal slavery, but it didn't end the exploitation of vulnerable people. The same economic forces, the same power dynamics, the same willingness to commodify human beings, these didn't disappear in 1865. They adapted, evolved, and found new forms. SHA, RECRO, convict leasing, segregation, and countless other systems continued to exploit the descendants of enslaved people. Meanwhile, new forms of trafficking emerged to exploit immigrants, indigenous people, and others who lacked legal protection. Today, human trafficking generates an estimated $150 billion annually worldwide. The techniques used by modern traffickers, isolation, manipulation, economic control, and psychological warfare are remarkably similar to those used by slave traders in the 1800s. Fancy girl trade didn't end. It went global, went digital, and went underground. But the resistance strategies developed by people like Sarah, Harriet Jacobs, and countless unnamed heroes remain relevant and powerful. Which brings us to the most important legacy of all, the power of speaking truth about systems of exploitation, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. For over a century after the Civil War, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women was largely erased from historical narratives. Textbooks focused on cotton and tobacco, ignoring the systematic rape and abuse that was equally central to the slave economy. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was designed to make slavery seem less horrific, to allow Americans to maintain comfortable myths about their history, and to prevent the kind of moral reckoning that might demand systemic change. But historians, activists, and descendants of enslaved people refused to let these stories stay buried. They fought to recover suppressed documents, to record oral histories before they were lost, and to force American society to confront the full truth of its past. This video is part of that ongoing struggle. Every story told, every name recovered, every truth spoken is an act of resistance against the forces that want to keep these histories hidden. So here's what I need from you. If this video has opened your eyes to hidden history, don't just hit the like button, share it. If this has made you angry about injustice, don't just feel that anger, channel it into action. If this has shown you connections between past and present exploitation, don't just recognize those connections, work to break them. The voices of Sarah, Harriet Jacobs, and countless other women who survived the fancy girl trade are still speaking to us across the centuries. They're reminding us that resistance is possible, that survival is powerful, and that truth will eventually triumph over even the most systematic evil. But only if we listen, only if we remember, only if we refuse to be silent in the face of ongoing exploitation and injustice. Their legacy is not just survival, it's the charge they've passed down to us to keep fighting, to keep speaking truth, and to keep working toward a world where no child ever again stands on an auction block, where no human being is ever again reduced to a price tag, where no system of exploitation ever again operates in plain sight while society chooses willful blindness. That's their legacy. That's their challenge to us. And that's why their stories must never be forgotten. If this video changed how you see American history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because YouTube doesn't promote content that challenges comfortable narratives. Share this with someone who needs to understand this history. Comment below about which part of this story affected you most. And remember, silence is complicity, but speaking truth is resistance. The next video in this series explores how the wealth generated by human trafficking shaped American capitalism and continues to influence our economy today. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for truth.